The Eastern Front of World War II was a place of unimaginable brutality, where entire cities burned to the ground and millions of lives were consumed by the grinding machinery of war. Yet, amid the thunder of artillery and the roar of tanks, there emerged a figure few expected to see in such a battlefield. Women with rifles, trained with precision, and feared by the most hardened German soldiers. They were the Soviet snipers, silent hunters who blended into the forests, rubble, and snow, whose single pull of the trigger could decide the fate of a soldier, an officer, or even a battle. Among them were names that still echo through history: Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Rosa Shanina, Aliyah Moldagulova, and countless others, each carrying not just a rifle, but the burden of representing a nation under siege. These women became symbols of defiance, of survival, and of death. Yet behind their stories of triumph and courage lies a darker truth, a brutal fate that awaited many of them, both on the battlefield and in the shadows of history itself. But how did these women come to embody one of the most feared roles in modern combat? Why did the Soviet Union, a country fighting for survival against the largest invasion in human history, turn to women to fill the ranks of its most lethal sharpshooters? And, perhaps most haunting of all, what became of them after the smoke cleared and the war was won? To understand this, we must step into the blood-soaked landscapes of the Eastern Front, where ideology collided with survival, and where a bullet fired from a hidden nest could silence a general or save a city. The story of the Soviet female snipers is one of empowerment, but also of tragedy. It is a reminder that even heroes are not spared from the merciless grip of war. It began in the summer of 1941, when Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The German Wehrmacht stormed across the Soviet borders with 3 million soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and an air force that seemed unstoppable. Town after town fell, and soon the very heart of the Soviet Union was under threat. In the chaos of this existential struggle, the Soviet leadership turned to every possible resource to resist. Factories were converted into war machines, farmers became soldiers, and women were called not only to support roles but to the front lines themselves. The Soviet Union was unique in this regard. While other nations hesitated to deploy women in combat, Stalin's government embraced it as necessity. Women flew fighter planes, operated anti-aircraft guns, and, crucially, were recruited into sniper schools. The reasoning was pragmatic. Women, it was believed, had steadier hands, better patience, and a natural aptitude for the precision and discipline required in sniping. It was a controversial decision, but in the crucible of war, ideology bent to survival. From this decision rose entire battalions of female snipers, trained in secret facilities deep in Soviet territory. Young women, many barely out of school, were handed Mosin-Nagant rifles with high-powered scopes and taught to kill with clinical efficiency. For many, the transition was shocking. They had been students, daughters, sisters, and suddenly they were hunters of men. Their classrooms were replaced with trenches, their textbooks with bullet cartridges, their futures with uncertainty. The training was merciless. Instructors drilled them for hours in camouflage, in patience, in the art of disappearing into landscapes of snow, grass, or rubble. They were taught not only how to pull the trigger, but when to wait for hours, even days, for the perfect shot. They were told to aim not at the mass of soldiers, but at the officers, the radio men, the machine gunners, the vital arteries of the German army. A single bullet, well placed, could cripple an entire unit. This was their mission, and they embraced it with grim determination. By late 1942, their presence was felt across the front lines. Stories spread among German troops of the unseen death that stalked them in the forests and ruined cities. A soldier could be laughing one moment, warming his hands by a fire, and the next, his body would collapse to the ground, a single hole between his eyes. Fear grew not only of snipers, but of the idea that these invisible killers were women. For the macho, battle-hardened Wehrmacht, there was humiliation in falling to the rifle of a Soviet girl. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. And yet, the lives of these women were far from the romanticized tales of propaganda. Yes, Soviet newspapers celebrated them, publishing their portraits and victory counts as symbols of the motherland's strength. But behind those numbers were stories of exhaustion, trauma, and loss. Many of them carried notebooks where they recorded each confirmed kill, not as trophies, but as haunting reminders of the lives they had taken. Some would write letters home, confessing the nightmares that followed each mission. Others simply hardened, their humanity stripped away by the relentless need to survive. One such figure was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, perhaps the most famous of them all. With 309 confirmed kills, she became a legend, dubbed Lady Death by the press. She toured the United States during the war, becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance. But even her story, remarkable as it was, hides a darker undercurrent. Pavlichenko suffered wounds, both physical and emotional, and after the war, she lived a life haunted by memories that no propaganda could erase. Yet for every Pavlichenko, whose name was remembered, there were countless others who vanished into obscurity. Take Rosa Shanina, a young woman from a small village who rose to fame with her unmatched skill. She was celebrated in Soviet newspapers, admired for her bravery, but in 1945, as the war drew to its bloody conclusion, she was killed in combat at just 20 years old. Her diaries, later published, revealed a girl torn between duty and despair, her words echoing the tragedy of a generation consumed by war. And then there were the nameless, the snipers who never made the headlines, who disappeared in forests or burned cities, their stories lost to time. Some were killed in combat. Others returned home only to face poverty, neglect, or silence. The Soviet Union, eager to move forward, often had little room for the complex legacies of its wartime heroines. Many female veterans struggled to find work, to rebuild families, to live with the weight of what they had seen and done. Their service, once celebrated, became a quiet shadow. This is the paradox of the Soviet female sniper. They were feared by the enemy, praised by their country, and yet ultimately abandoned by history. Their rifles gave them power in a world that often denied women agency. But that power came with a cost, a brutal fate that no medal or speech could erase. So what truly became of them? Were they remembered as heroes, or forgotten as relics of a desperate time? Were they empowered by their role, or destroyed by the very war that thrust them into history? The answers lie not only in the statistics of kills or the pages of propaganda, but in the personal stories, the diaries, the photographs left behind. In these fragments, we glimpse both the triumph and the tragedy of the Soviet female snipers. And as we move deeper into their world, we must confront a haunting truth. Behind every legend of a deadly sharpshooter was a human being, young and fragile, caught in the most brutal conflict the world has ever known. Their story is not just about war. It is about survival, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of being remembered as both weapon and woman. If the battlefield was the crucible that revealed their strength, the sniper school was the furnace where their steel was forged. To understand what these young Soviet women endured, we must step into the world of the Central Women's Sniper Training School, located outside Moscow. It was 1942, and the war had entered its bloodiest stage. Every day, the front demanded new soldiers, but Stalin's command was clear. Women would not only fill the ranks of medics, nurses, and communication officers. They would also become killers. Silent, precise, lethal. Imagine being 18 years old, barely out of secondary school, and suddenly handed a Mosin-Nagant rifle equipped with a PU scope. The weapon was long, heavy, and cold in their hands. Instructors barked orders. Targets appeared at distances of 300, 500, even 800 meters. These girls, some of whom had never held a weapon before, now had to master the art of stillness, the science of breathing, and the patience of waiting hours for a single shot. The school was rigorous, merciless, almost inhuman in its demands. Days began at dawn with physical training. Snow or rain didn't matter. They crawled through mud, learned camouflage techniques, and practiced digging into frozen ground to build hidden firing positions. Every mistake was punished, not with words, but with repetition until perfection was achieved. But it wasn't only about marksmanship. Snipers had to become ghosts. They were taught to blend with their surroundings, to use branches, leaves, and even snow to cover their bodies. They painted their faces with mud or soot. They practiced staying motionless for hours, suppressing the natural urge to shift, scratch, or even blink too much. One instructor famously told them, "If the enemy sees you before you fire, you are already dead." For many of these women, the transformation was shocking. They had arrived in uniform but with braids, ribbons, and a sparkle of youthful innocence. Within weeks, their eyes hardened. They became statues in human form, capable of waiting a full day just for the right shot. The school was not just technical training, it was psychological conditioning. Instructors asked them again and again, "Can you look at a man through a scope, see the color of his eyes, and then squeeze the trigger? Can you do this not once, but dozens, maybe hundreds of times?" Those who hesitated washed out. Those who stayed behind learned to silence that inner voice of hesitation. Among them were names that history would later remember. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, often called the Lady Death, had already made her reputation before the establishment of the school, but she became a symbol for what these women could achieve. Yet countless others, unknown, unrecorded, passed through those same training grounds. They would never be remembered individually, but collectively, they carried an aura of deadly precision. The instructors were often veterans, men scarred by the front. They did not treat these women with softness. On the contrary, many pushed them harder, knowing that the battlefield would be even less forgiving. Some women secretly confessed in their diaries that they feared their instructors more than the thought of Germans, because the men demanded absolute perfection. 1 centimeter of error in aim could mean death. As weeks turned into months, a strange transformation took place. These women, who once sang songs in their dormitories, who missed home, who scribbled poems in notebooks, began to see the world differently. The scope became their window. They no longer looked at a tree, a field, or a ruined village as scenery. Instead, they calculated distances, angles, and shadows. They looked for cover, escape routes, and firing positions. In short, their eyes became weapons before their rifles did. Yet, the school was not without moments of humanity. At night, when the day's grueling exercises were over, they whispered to each other in bunks. They shared bread, exchanged letters from home, and sometimes giggled about the clumsy attempts of male soldiers to impress them during training overlaps. Some wrote diaries reflecting on their fear of killing. One girl wrote, "I still don't know if I can do it. The target is wood, not flesh. What happens when the target breathes, when it bleeds?" Those doubts lingered in many minds, but the war outside did not wait for their answers. By the end of their course, they were no longer schoolgirls, they were soldiers. Each had fired thousands of rounds, learned to crawl kilometers under barbed wire, and endured hunger and exhaustion. Many graduated with excellent scores. They were now prepared, at least in theory, to enter the chaos of war. When graduation day came, there was no ceremony filled with flowers and applause. Instead, there was silence, orders, and deployment papers. The front lines awaited. Groups of women were assigned to different armies, often paired with male snipers who at first doubted them. Some of these men openly sneered, "How can a girl hold a rifle heavier than her arms?" But those doubts would vanish after the first battles, when the women proved not only their skill but also their iron will. The moment they stepped onto the train toward the front, the reality of their transformation hit them. They were no longer anonymous faces in the crowd. They were hunters now. Some carried small personal tokens, a family photograph, a locket, a notebook, hidden in their uniform pockets. But over their shoulders rested the true symbol of their identity. The long barrel of the Mosin-Nagant, wrapped in cloth, waiting for its first kill. Their commanders had high expectations. Snipers were not ordinary soldiers. They were psychological weapons. Every shot had to count. A German officer struck down by a sniper's bullet was not only a casualty. It sent ripples of fear through enemy lines. That was their purpose, to spread terror as much as to eliminate enemies. But what no training could fully prepare them for was the confrontation with the human face of war. Through the glass of their scopes, they would soon see eyes, lips, and expressions. They would see fear on the faces of men who, only a second later, would no longer exist. That was the true test, not aim, not patience, but the weight of becoming both witness and executioner. The women knew it. Some even confessed that their hands shook the first time they lined up their crosshairs on a living man. But hesitation was a luxury the battlefield would not allow. The day was coming when they would take that first shot, and everything about them would change forever. And so, from the cold classrooms and training fields of Moscow, the women snipers emerged as shadows, silent hunters soon to be unleashed upon the battlefield. They carried with them the lessons of their instructors, the discipline of endless drills, and the chilling knowledge that they were now part of the deadliest fraternity of war. The question that hung over them was not whether they could shoot. That had been answered. The real question was, once they began, would they ever be able to stop seeing the world through the crosshairs? The train screeched to a halt in a landscape that seemed carved from smoke and ash. For many of the young women, this was their first glimpse of the front lines. Villages reduced to skeletons of stone, forests burned into blackened sticks, and the faint stench of gunpowder that lingered in the air. This was no longer the sterile practice ground of Moscow. This was war. They stepped off the train, rifles slung over their shoulders, boots crunching against the frozen earth. Male soldiers stared as they passed, some with curiosity, others with open derision. A group of infantrymen muttered, "Girls? Here." One smirked, shaking his head. "The Germans will eat them alive." But the commanders didn't laugh. They knew what these women had trained for. They were not ordinary recruits, they were weapons. Their first assignment was simple in words but terrifying in execution. Hold the line outside a ruined village where German troops were preparing an assault. The women snipers were positioned on the edges of the battlefield, given vantage points from barns, collapsed roofs, and camouflaged pits dug in the earth. It was time for their baptism of fire. One of the young snipers, barely 19, pressed her cheek against the cold wood of her rifle. Through the scope, she saw him, a German soldier moving cautiously near the treeline. His helmet gleamed faintly in the morning light. He bent down, adjusting something on the ground. Her training whispered to her, "Slow breath, steady hand, exhale, squeeze." Her finger hovered, her heart hammered. This was no longer a wooden silhouette painted black. This was flesh, blood, a man with lungs full of air, perhaps with a family waiting at home. She hesitated. A second felt like an eternity. Then she remembered the words of her instructor. "If you don't shoot, he will." She pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed against her shoulder. The soldier dropped instantly, collapsing in the mud, motionless. She didn't breathe for a moment. She had done it. She had killed a man. The world felt heavier, but there was no time to reflect. More targets appeared. German patrols moved, officers barked orders, and the battle escalated. Soon, the women were firing again and again. Each shot was precise, calculated, deliberate. One by one, enemy soldiers fell. That first day, the women proved themselves. Reports came back to the Soviet commanders. The new female snipers had held their ground, silencing machine gun crews, officers, and scouts. They were invisible phantoms, and the Germans began to whisper of them almost immediately. Fear spread not because of their numbers but because of their accuracy. Among them, Lyudmila Pavlichenko stood as a legend already in the making. She had joined earlier in the war, and her kill count was climbing into the hundreds. She became a symbol not just of skill but of determination. Pavlichenko once said, "Every German soldier I kill saves the life of a Soviet soldier." That philosophy became the mantra of many women snipers. It wasn't about hatred. It was about survival, theirs and their comrades. The Germans soon learned to dread the soundless terror of Soviet snipers. A single shot from an unseen position could turn a calm trench into chaos. Men refused to lift their heads above the parapets. Commanders grew paranoid. Some German officers even offered rewards to those who could eliminate these unseen witches of the Red Army. But the danger was not one-sided. For every sniper, there was a counter-sniper. The Germans deployed their own sharpshooters, skilled hunters tasked with seeking out the women. It became a deadly duel, scope against scope, patience against patience. Hours could pass in silence, two figures lying motionless in the snow, waiting for the other to blink first. One chilling account describes how a Soviet sniper lay in her position for nearly 20 hours, refusing to move, knowing a German was searching for her. She endured hunger, thirst, and the freezing bite of winter. Finally, she saw the faint glint of glass, the German scope catching the light. She fired. A single second decided life and death. She walked away alive. He did not. Still, the psychological toll mounted. Through their scopes, the women saw the humanity of their enemies. Eyes widening in fear, lips whispering last words, bodies crumpling like broken dolls. Some women confessed in diaries that the images haunted them at night. Yet others hardened, pushing the thoughts aside, replacing hesitation with cold efficiency. By 1943, the women snipers had become both feared and celebrated. The Soviets used them not only for their military skill but also as propaganda. Photographs of smiling young women in uniforms, rifles slung over their shoulders, appeared in newspapers. They were portrayed as heroines, symbols of Soviet resilience. But behind those staged images lay exhaustion, trauma, and the weight of hundreds of silent kills. One story captures the duality perfectly. A young sniper named Rosa Shanina, often called the girl with the deadly aim, became famous for her precision. In photographs, she looked almost like any other 20-year-old, with bright eyes and a quiet smile. But in her diary, she confessed deep pain. "I am killing people, but in reality, I long for compassion and gentleness." She was torn between the role the war demanded and the humanity she still carried. Despite their skill, these women were never invincible. Many died in combat. German artillery, machine guns, and countersnipers claimed countless lives. Those captured faced brutal fates, often tortured and executed, seen as special trophies by the enemy. The risk was constant, the survival rate slim, and yet they kept coming. Trains delivered fresh recruits from the sniper school, each with a rifle and a steel will. They joined the veterans, learning quickly or dying quickly. The battlefield was the harshest teacher of all. But what made them endure? Perhaps it was patriotism. Perhaps vengeance for families killed by German bombs. Perhaps simply survival, the knowledge that if they didn't fight, there would be no home left to return to. Whatever the reason, their eyes grew colder, their hands steadier, and their names began to carve themselves into the strange, bloody ledger of history. By the middle of the war, Soviet female snipers had killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. They weren't just anomalies, they were an integral part of the Soviet war machine. Germany, with all its tanks, planes, and mechanized divisions, feared these quiet figures with rifles almost as much as it feared the Red Army's artillery. The women knew, however, that they were also expendable. They were given respect when it suited propaganda, but little protection. Their survival depended on their own instincts, their ability to remain invisible. One wrong move, one glint of light, one careless breath, and it was over. The first shot had been the hardest. After that, killing became routine. Yet each kill, no matter how routine, etched another scar on their souls. The battlefield was transforming them. Once they had been daughters, students, dreamers. Now they were hunters and prey. And as the war raged on, another grim truth became clear. No matter how many enemies they killed, no matter how skilled they became, the Soviet female snipers were marching toward a brutal fate. Some would fall in combat. Others would survive, only to return to a homeland that often chose to forget their sacrifice. Their baptism of fire was only the beginning. The true test was not just surviving the battlefield, but surviving what the battlefield did to their humanity. The Eastern Front was shifting. After the nightmare of Stalingrad and the blood-soaked fields of Kursk, the tide of war had begun to turn. Soviet forces were pushing westward, reclaiming city after city, village after village, at a staggering cost. And among them, silent and steady, were the women with rifles who had already become legends. For the female snipers, the victories brought no relief. Every advance meant more battles, more ambushes, more duels of patience against unseen German sharpshooters. The war was not yet won, and in the forests, in the ruins, in the muddy trenches, death lurked with every step. Rosa Shanina, whose diary would later shock historians with its raw honesty, wrote in 1944, "I have no fear of being killed, but I am afraid of leaving this world without doing enough." She marched with her unit across the smoldering remains of Belarus, each step taking her closer to Germany. By then, her reputation was so great that even male officers sought her advice on concealment and positioning. Yet despite her fame, she carried a loneliness that gnawed at her. In quiet moments, she still wrote about her longing for love, for normalcy, for a world beyond the endless thunder of artillery. But for many, the possibility of a world beyond the war seemed impossible. One sniper recalled how, in the ruins of a Polish town, she watched a group of children play among the rubble. Their laughter was thin, nervous, the sound of innocence trying to exist in a landscape where innocence had been obliterated. "I could not imagine what kind of future they would have," she admitted later, "and I could not imagine one for myself." The psychological toll was immense. Killing had become second nature, but living with the memories was unbearable. In letters and diaries, the women spoke of nightmares, faces of the fallen, cries echoing in their ears, shadows that followed them even in sleep. Yet by day, they were unshakable, calm, and efficient, because anything less meant death. The Germans, increasingly desperate, began treating Soviet female snipers as priority targets. They spread rumors among their troops that the women were merciless, even demonic, a tactic that both dehumanized the women and heightened the fear surrounding them. Captured snipers were rarely spared. Testimonies from the front suggest that many women who fell into German hands faced brutal, often fatal, treatment. The snipers knew this. They fought with the knowledge that capture meant something worse than death. For them, the only choices were victory or the silence of the grave. Despite the risks, their kill counts grew. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who had become a living myth, continued to strike fear into the Wehrmacht until she was eventually withdrawn from the front and sent abroad for propaganda tours. In the United States, she met President Roosevelt and even Eleanor Roosevelt, becoming a symbol of female strength. American journalists were astonished by her calm demeanor and her staggering record of over 300 confirmed kills. Yet beneath the polite interviews and official speeches, Pavlichenko carried the same scars as her comrades. She had seen too much, and no amount of applause could erase it. For others, there would be no tours, no recognition. Their names are now forgotten, buried in mass graves or faded Soviet records. One young sniper, remembered only by fragments of diary pages, wrote shortly before her death, "The hardest part is not the cold or the hunger. It is the silence after the shot. When the world pauses, and I realize I have ended a man's life. The silence is louder than the gunfire." The silence grew heavier as the war dragged into its final years. By 1944 and 1945, the women snipers were advancing into Eastern Europe, entering territories where civilians had suffered under German occupation for years. What they witnessed left indelible marks on their souls. Entire villages wiped out, mass graves uncovered, survivors skeletal and broken. Some women wrote that their hatred for the enemy deepened with every liberated town. Others confessed that the atrocities only made the act of killing more unbearable, because now they understood the vastness of human suffering. As Soviet forces pushed into Hungary and later into Germany itself, the female snipers played a crucial role in street fighting. In ruined cities like Budapest and eventually Berlin, their rifles became instruments of precision in the chaos of urban warfare. Perched in shattered buildings, they hunted enemy officers and machine gun crews, turning the concrete labyrinth into their killing fields. Yet these were also the most dangerous missions. The close quarters left them vulnerable, and many never returned from the ruins. Rosa Shanina was one of those who did not live to see victory. In early 1945, she was struck by mortar fire while shielding a wounded comrade. She was 20 years old. In her diary, she had written of her wish to live long enough to see the final Soviet victory. Instead, her life ended just months before Germany's surrender. Her comrades buried her quickly, in the frozen ground, before moving on to the next battle. Her death was not unique. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of female snipers fell in the war's final year. Some were killed instantly in combat. Others lingered in field hospitals, their young lives ebbing away in the midst of screams and blood. Their names were often reduced to numbers in casualty lists. The war consumed them as it had consumed millions of others. And yet, despite the losses, the snipers achieved a grim kind of immortality. Collectively, Soviet women snipers killed more than 10,000 enemy soldiers. Their precision saved countless Soviet lives. In the eyes of many frontline troops, they were guardian angels, striking unseen enemies before they could kill again. One soldier later said, "When I knew a sniper was covering us, I felt braver. I felt that death would not find me so quickly." But the women themselves felt no such comfort. Each life they took weighed on them, even if it was necessary. One veteran, interviewed decades later, confessed with tears in her eyes, "I still see their faces, every one of them. I was young. I thought I was serving my country. But at night, I asked myself if I ever truly came home." This was the paradox of their fate. Hailed as heroes by their nation, feared by their enemies, yet haunted by their own memories. Victory did not erase the scars. If anything, it deepened them. The celebrations of May 1945, the fireworks, the parades, the anthems, felt hollow to many of them. While the world cheered the end of the war, they mourned the sisters they had lost, the innocence they had buried, and the selves they could never recover. And still, even in the aftermath, their story was not fully told. In the Soviet Union, the official narrative focused on glory and sacrifice, not on trauma or doubt. The women who returned home were expected to put down their rifles, marry, have children, and resume life as if nothing had happened. Many never spoke of their wartime experiences again. Others carried their memories like ghosts, silently, until the day they died. The war was ending, but for the Soviet female snipers, the battle within themselves had only just begun. The war that had once demanded their courage ended with silence, but for many of the Soviet female snipers, the silence was as haunting as the battlefield itself. Victory in May 1945 brought the thunder of celebration across the Soviet Union. Yet for these women, the echoes of gunfire still rang in their minds. They had faced the horrors of the front, watched comrades fall one by one, and survived by blending into the shadows. But peace did not bring them the honor they had expected. Instead, it brought a brutal and unsettling fate. When the guns quieted, Moscow celebrated heroes, generals, tank commanders, and decorated male soldiers who were paraded as symbols of victory. Female snipers, however, were pushed to the margins of memory. Though many had racked up dozens, even hundreds, of confirmed kills, their stories were rarely told with the same pride. Some were dismissed as anomalies, others ignored entirely, as if their wartime sacrifices did not fit into the narrative the Soviet state wished to construct. One of the most haunting stories was that of Rosa Shanina. She had been celebrated during the war as the unseen terror of the Eastern Front, a young woman with piercing eyes and an almost supernatural ability to track her targets. But Rosa did not live to see the victory she had fought for. In January 1945, just months before the war ended, she was struck down by artillery while shielding a wounded soldier. Her diary, found later, revealed a chilling introspection. She had written about feeling doomed, about the unbearable toll of killing, and about the loneliness of a girl trapped in a soldier's life. Her words became a testament not just to skill, but to the deep scars carved by war into a human soul. For those who returned, survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another battle. Many female snipers came home expecting recognition, only to find suspicion instead. Whispers followed them. How could a woman kill like that? Some were branded as unfeminine, others as dangerous. In a society eager to rebuild its families and repopulate its cities, women who had lived in the shadows of death no longer fit neatly into their assigned roles. The brutal irony was that the very skills that had saved their lives on the battlefield became a source of mistrust in peacetime. Neighbors avoided them, colleagues gossiped, and potential husbands recoiled. The word sniper, once synonymous with heroism, became for many a stain. Some veterans even claimed that these women were treated as if they were tainted, marked by death itself. And yet, within the Soviet state, propaganda needed selective stories. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, perhaps the most famous of them all, was spared this fate. She had been pulled from the front mid-war and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, where she met Eleanor Roosevelt and became a symbol of Soviet female bravery. After the war, she was celebrated and remembered, though even she lived with the scars of constant nightmares and the weight of memory. But Lyudmila was the exception, not the rule. The majority of her comrades were forgotten, buried not just in graves, but in silence. They carried invisible wounds, what we would now call PTSD, yet in the Soviet Union such conditions were rarely acknowledged. Night after night, some woke drenched in sweat, hearing phantom rifles crack across their dreams. Others carried physical scars, missing fingers, ruined eyes, lungs weakened by years in frozen trenches. Their bodies bore testimony to their sacrifice, but society offered little sympathy. The story of Natalia Kovshova and Maria Polovanova was perhaps the most tragic illustration of the brutality these women faced. Surrounded by Germans in 1942 with no way out, they pulled the pins from their grenades and chose death over capture. Their sacrifice was honored with posthumous Hero of the Soviet Union awards. Yet how many people, decades later, could even recall their names? Their decision to die together, refusing surrender, became a ghost story whispered only among veterans. What makes their legacy even more haunting is how the Soviet system itself erased them from the grand narrative of war. Official histories mention them in passing, if at all. Photographs disappeared into archives, diaries went unpublished, and their very existence was treated as inconvenient. In the carefully curated memory of World War II, the ideal Soviet woman was a grieving mother, a factory worker, or a nurse, not a sniper with a rifle and cold eyes peering through a scope. For the women themselves, silence became both a shield and a prison. Some tried to live quiet lives, marrying and raising families, never speaking of what they had done. Others, when asked about the war, would change the subject, hiding their medals in drawers. But there were those who could not escape their memories. Alcohol dulled the pain for some, isolation consumed others. The fate of many remains undocumented. Their stories lost not because they were unworthy, but because no one wanted to hear them. And yet, despite this erasure, their ghosts remain. In the forests where they once hid, in the ruins where they once waited, and in the archives where their names still flicker like fading embers. The very existence of these women challenges the way we remember war. They were not symbols. They were not propaganda. They were human beings who bore the unbearable and paid a price few could imagine. Imagine standing in a trench, frost biting at your skin, your rifle clutched tight. You hear footsteps, German infantry moving cautiously. You steady your breath, your finger on the trigger. And then, when the enemy falls, you feel nothing. No triumph, no hatred, just a hollow emptiness. This was the daily reality of these snipers. And that emptiness followed them home, where it echoed louder than any gunshot. Today, historians and storytellers are slowly unearthing their stories. Diaries long locked away are being published, photos restored, memories pieced together. And as they emerge, they paint a picture not of cold-blooded killers, but of young women thrust into a war that demanded they abandon innocence and embrace death as a companion. Their fate was brutal not just because of what the enemy did, but because of what their own country chose to forget. They fought, bled, and died for a homeland that, in peacetime, turned its eyes away. And yet, their courage remains undeniable. To stand with a rifle, knowing that discovery meant torture or death, was an act of resolve few could match. To live with the aftermath, with memories too heavy to share, was an act of endurance even greater. And so, the story of the Soviet female snipers ends not with glory, but with a silence heavier than any battlefield. It is a silence filled with questions. What does it mean to sacrifice everything for a nation that forgets you? What does it mean to fight as a woman in a world that refuses to see your strength? And what does it mean when the only recognition you receive comes decades too late, whispered by historians instead of sung by the country you saved? Theirs is a legacy written in shadows, carved into the ruins of Stalingrad and buried beneath the forests of the Eastern Front. A legacy of courage, pain, and erasure. The brutal fate of the Soviet female snipers was not just death in war, it was silence in peace. But perhaps silence is not the end. Perhaps, in telling their stories now, we give them what they were denied: remembrance. They may have been forgotten by the state, but they do not need to be forgotten by us. For in the end, remembrance is resistance, and remembering them is the only way to break the silence.